afternoon, students. Today, we will have a discussion on liberalism as a part of our discussion in paper 1, Political Science and International Relations, which includes the topic on ideologies. Liberalism is probably the most important ideology which had a greatest impact on the modern times. In fact, the history of modern political thought is sometimes also called as history of liberal ideology. So much had been the impact of liberalism. And within the fold of the liberal ideology, we have utilitarians, we have social contractualists, we have laissez-faire individualists, we have proponents of welfare state. So many political thinkers are within the fold of this very broad ideology called liberalism. Now, we know that in the modern period, liberalism grew as an intellectual tradition or a movement, and it represented an opposition to oppressive feudal order. There was feudalism, and feudalism was oppressive, and liberalism as an ideology was a voice against this oppressive feudalism. Also, liberalism represented a voice against corrupt and exploitative church, and also authoritarian political regimes. Therefore, liberalism, it represented a progressive movement and an ideology. It represented an intellectual tradition which had a forward-looking agenda. Okay, it was this ideology which was about giving up on all those medieval institutions and medieval thinking, which had, in fact, led to a very big impediment in human progress. In fact, that the medieval period was sometimes also referred to as Dark Ages. It's also sometimes referred to as Dark Ages, primarily because of the fact that in the entire period of the medieval age, there was no considerable progress. There was no development. There was no technology. There was no art, no architecture, no literature, no philosophy. The entire medieval period was steeped in obscurantism, and men were subjected to a lot of controls, restrictions, obstructions. Men could not enjoy their freedom. And that's the reason why the entire medieval period did not witness the birth of even one notable political philosopher. After the ancient Greek political tradition, people had to wait till Machiavelli for seeing progress in political philosophy, which was of some significance. All this was because of the oppressive and restrictive conditions that were present in the medieval period. Liberalism as an ideology was a voice against such a socio-political scenario. It was a voice against such oppressive condition. It was a voice against authoritarian rule, exploitative church, and oppressive feudal order. Liberalism, therefore, can be considered as a very progressive ideology. As I told you, it was a movement against feudal order. It was a movement against political regimes, authoritarian political regimes, absolute monarchies. And it was also a voice against exploitative church. Okay? Now, there are a galaxy of political thinkers who contributed in a myriad ways to the progression of the liberal ideology. Starting from, of course, Machiavelli, who is considered as the first modern political thinker, because he was the one who attempted to break political science from the clutches of religion. And following him, we have, the social contractualists like Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau. Then we have several other political thinkers, like the high priest of individual liberty called J.S. Mill. All these people have upheld the liberal tradition in political science. They have upheld the liberal ideology in political science. Actually, the term liberalism can be traced to the French term liberals, which actually means freedom. In fact, liberalism is an ideology which holds a central place to individual liberty. Okay? It holds a central place to individual liberty. And therefore, freedom is the most important value for this ideology, individual freedom. I told you that this was a movement against all kinds of restrictions that were imposed on individuals. The entire medieval period was sometimes described as Christendom. There were two forces: Christ, the kingdom, the religion and the kingdom. Religion controlled man's thoughts, and the king, the monarch, he controlled individuals' actions. Therefore, both internally as well as externally, individuals were subjected to all kinds of controls. And that's the reason why there was absolutely no progress. There was no development. Okay, and that's the reason why this order, the medieval order, had to be overthrown. Okay. And then we saw the birth of the modern age. The modern age is also called as the age of reason. Men began to exercise reason. Men began to think rationally. Men began to look at things as not whether they are right or wrong, not as whether they are moral or immoral, but as whether they are true or false. Men began to exercise rationality, which led to what's called as positivism. It was a positivist movement. Science began to be deployed more and more in understanding our physical world. Men began to, engage in use of modern methods. Men began to use technology. Men began to understand and decipher meanings of natural forces and stopped relying on religious texts to seek answers for all the questions around the physical phenomena that individuals had to face in their daily life. So this was how the modern age began, and I told you that the modern age almost coincides with the birth of a new tradition in political science called liberalism. Enlightenment, Renaissance, okay, all these have given a very big impetus to this ideology called liberalism. And as I told you, liberalism gives greatest importance to individual liberty. Okay, it gives a lot of importance to individual liberty. Of course, there were a lot of political thinkers even before the modern age. Even in the ancient period, also, in the times of ancient Greece, there were some thinkers who were called as physiocrats. Okay, they were the very first ones who preached, individual freedom. Physiocrats in ancient Greek period also preached individual freedom and liberty, but as a coherent ideology, an ideology which is very systematic with well-founded basis. We can see the sprouting of liberalism as an ideology only in the modern times, as a very systematic, well-founded, and a coherent ideology. Liberalism can be traced only to the modern times. Now, as I told you, this liberalism as an ideology can be traced to the aspirations of the newly rising middle classes. Okay. Now, the newly emerging dominant classes were the middle classes, and these middle classes wanted freedom from king, from church. Also, they wanted freedom to pursue their economic vocations and their economic interests, and they were not to be impeded by the then feudal and oppressive political regime. Therefore, this newly rising middle classes wanted freedom. They wanted freedom. It is in this context that we can say very safely that liberalism represents the interests of the rising middle classes. It represents the interests of the rising middle classes. And therefore, as I told you, this was a voice against an oppressive earlier order, and that's the reason why it's called sometimes as a progressive ideology. Therefore, liberalism began as a progressive ideology. It began as a progressive ideology. However, after establishing itself as the most dominant ideology, it became status quoist. However, initially, it was a progressive ideology which sought to overthrow the then existing oppressive feudal and authoritarian political order. Okay, and also one very discerning feature about liberalism is that this ideology is extremely flexible and it's very dynamic. And that's the reason why there was one political thinker called Ramsay Muir. Who calls liberalism as a chameleon-like creed. A chameleon-like creed. Which changes its colors as and when, new dangers appear. For example, when communism began to erupt, there's a very serious threat or challenge to liberal ideology, which is still then the dominant ideology. Liberalism began to slowly change its form. And from negative liberalism, it became positive liberalism. Okay. Anyway, we'll look at what that is very soon. Now, it was a very extremely flexible and a dynamic ideology, liberalism. Thirdly, I told you that there are a series of political thinkers, who propounded several ideas which contributed very richly to the evolution of liberalism as an ideology. For example, we have Machiavelli. Machiavelli, in fact, upheld a very, very strong nation state. He upheld unlimited power to the prince. He, in fact, goes to the extent of saying that prince should not be limited by religion or morals or ethics. None of them should stand in prince's vocation in conducting statecraft. That was what Machiavelli had propounded. So, an absolutist like Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes, for instance, okay, a liberal to the core like John Locke, and again an absolutist like Hegel, who upheld nation state, and thinkers like T.H. Green, Thomas Hill Green, who proposed welfare functions to the state, or a utilitarian like Jeremy Bentham, or the high priest of individual liberty, J.S. Mill. All these political thinkers have contributed in their own way to the evolution of liberal ideology. Okay. Apart from political thinkers, there are a series of political economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus, who also contributed very richly to the evolution of liberalism as an ideology. So liberalism had gained contributions from a varied set of thinkers who are, political scientists, political economists, political sociologists as well. So many people have, contributed to the corpus of liberal ideology. And this ideology could then amass so much of support from such diverse quarters that it became very flexible. It became so very flexible that it could change with circumstances. It could face opposing ideologies. It could provide answers to challenges that, faced societies. For example, when classical liberalism was challenged, when trade cycles and frequent interruptions in economic activities threatened the claim of liberalism as the best way to organize social and economic activity, liberalism slowly changed its form. It became positive liberalism. Particularly after the Great Economic Depression of 1929, a good number of liberals themselves have proposed a greater state intervention in economic activities. It shows that liberalism had been a very flexible and dynamic ideology. Okay. So, apart from political scientists, there are a series of political economists and political sociologists who supported liberalism. And as I told you, initially, when liberalism started, it started as classical liberalism. We can divide liberalism, the evolution or the life cycle of liberalism can be divided into various phases. I told you, right? Liberalism began to change its form, began to change its content, began to change its principles also based on requirements. The fundamental premises and the foundations of liberalism also were changed sometimes, to suit the requirements. And that's the reason why liberalism could sustain in so much of opposition, in so much of social upheaval, in so much of antagonism. Despite of so many inadequacies within the liberal ideology, liberalism could sustain primarily because of this feature that liberalism has. It's a very flexible and a dynamic ideology. That's striking feature of this ideology called liberalism. Okay, the liberalism started its journey as classical liberalism, and then it became, after a while, modern liberalism, and then of course again it became libertarianism or contemporary liberalism. We'll look at those a little later. We'll begin with classical liberalism. Now, what is it that classical liberalism stands for? I told you that liberalism as an ideology stands for individual liberty, and it places individual liberty at the prime value. Okay, and it believes that individuals are rational. They are rational and they're capable of taking their decisions. They don't have to be guided. Individuals are capable of identifying their self-interests. Individuals are capable of pursuing their self-interests to their maximum abilities. They don't require to be guided, they don't require to be directed, they don't require to be shown the path by state or any other agency. Individuals by themselves are capable enough. Therefore, liberalism begins with a very firm belief in individual. That's the reason why sometimes, individualism is considered to be at the very core of liberal ideology. Individualism, it believes in the individual. It upholds individual liberty. It believes that every institution that we have created around, every ideology that we have sprouted, are primarily for improving or betterment of individual's life. This is what is the fundamental premise of liberalism. It believes that individuals are rational and they are capable of identifying and pursuing their self-interests. And secondly, classical liberalism also supports atomized notion of individual. Just as an atom is self-sufficient, individual also is self-sufficient. In fact, this is what's called as an atomized individual. Now, this has been criticized very heavily right from the onset of liberalism itself. Liberalism, therefore, creates a divide between individual and society, which sometimes is called as abstract individualism by Marxists. Marxists call this type of individualism as abstract individualism because it tries to bring about or it tries to conceive a divide between individual and society. Okay. Anyway, it supports the idea of an atomized individual and it believes that individuals are rational. And therefore, liberalism, by implication, supports that these individuals who are rational and who are self-sufficient should be given their maximum freedom. Their freedom should not be tampered with. Their freedom should not be infringed upon. They should be given freedom. They should be given freedom to take their decisions. They should be given freedom to make their choices. They should be given freedom to pursue their interests. The state should not interfere in any way with individuals. The state, according to liberals, should be a minimum state. The state should be a minimum state. A minimum state is a state, which performs bare minimum functions of, maintaining order, implementing laws, enforcing contracts, protecting individuals from internal or external threats. Such kind of bare minimum functions is what the state should be. The state should be a regulatory state. It should only regulate. It should not try to develop individuals because individuals are themselves capable of self-development. The state should not or need not try to develop individuals. Okay, the state should only try to regulate society so that laws are enforced, order is maintained, individuals are protected against threats, contracts are enforced, contracts entered into between individuals should be enforced. And that kind of role should be played by the state. Okay, this is what's called as minimum state. Or sometimes it's also called as the night watchman's view of state. The night watchman's view of state. Okay, the state should be like a night watchman. Night watchman normally he takes rest. Okay, when things are in order, but whenever there is a disorder, the night watchman should get up, should wake up, and set things in order again. That should be the role of the state. The state should not normally interfere. The state should not normally interfere. Liberals believe that society can be founded on self-directing capability of individuals. You can build societies on the self-directing capability of individuals. Individuals are self-directing. They are capable of taking their decisions and leave individual with his freedom. He will be able to direct himself. That is enough to create a safe and a sane society. Okay. Each individual pursuing his self-interest is enough, okay, to realize common good. The liberals, therefore, see no contradiction between individual self-interest and common interest. There is no contradiction. Every individual pursuing his self-interest is enough to realize common good. A, B, C, D, E, F, everybody, they're all pursuing their self-interests. Ultimately, everybody's interests are served. Signifying common good is served. This is what is the belief of the liberals. Give individuals freedom. They are capable of self-direction. They are capable of taking their decision. Let them take their decisions. The state should not interfere. Each individual pursuing his self-interest is enough to realize common good. This is the fundamental claim of the liberal ideology. Okay? We believe that society can be founded on the self-directing capability of individuals. So these are the fundamental assumptions of liberalism, my dear friends. Keep that in mind. Okay. Socially, liberalism upholds a secular order. Socially, it upholds a secular order. It means that society should be secular. Each individual should have freedom to pursue his beliefs. Each individual should have freedom to choose his religion. Each individual should have freedom to establish his relationship with God. The freedom to choose one's faith, the freedom to have one's values and beliefs is what's called as a secular order. Socially, liberalism stands for a secular order. Politically, liberalism upholds democracy and rule of law. The political system, according to liberals, is one which should seek to promote individual liberty. That can be possible only in a democratic political system. In a political system in which there is well-entrenched rule of law. Okay, this is what liberals believe. The economic system upheld by liberal ideology is based on capitalism. Okay, capitalism should be the mode of production according to liberals. They believe that the state should not interfere in economic activities. Individuals should be having freedom to pursue their economic objectives. Individuals should have freedom to take their economic decisions. The state should not seek to control economic activities at all. The economic decisions, very broadly, there are only 5 economic decisions to be made, isn't it? What to produce, how to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, and how to distribute. All the economic questions will be determined by the forces of market called demand and supply. The state shall not interfere. Capitalism. Individuals should have the power to own, possess, and acquire property. Right of private property. The economic system will be organized. The production of goods and services will be organized by the private sector. The private sector will be the engine for economic development. Okay, these are some fundamental premises of liberal ideology. It stands for capitalism. So socially, liberalism stands for a secular order. Politically, liberalism stands for democracy and rule of law. As a part of the economic system, liberalism upholds capitalist mode of production. Internationally, liberal ideology proposes the concept of nation state and the idea of national sovereignty, state sovereignty. These are the 2 important concepts which are associated with the international system proposed and upheld by the liberal ideology. This, very broadly, is liberal ideology. These are the fundamental assumptions of the liberal ideology. Okay.